Good evening. I'm Linda Chamberlain, and tonight we're going to be talking about the amazing adolescent brain. I'm going to go ahead and share screen now. Adolescence is a unique time in brain development. The adolescent brain is not like a child's brain, and it's not like an adult brain. It is unique unto itself. And with that comes tremendous opportunity and also vulnerability. So that's what we'll be talking about in the next hour. We talk a lot about young children, infants, 0 to 3 and 0 to 6, and the extraordinary neuroplasticity that we see in those years. Well, adolescence is a huge window of opportunity for neuroplasticity as well. This is play foam that I have in my hands when I talk to teens about their amazing brains, and they need to hear this as much as caregivers, communities, service providers, and so forth. They make amazing things out of it. And it's really great to demonstrate the fact that the brain adapts and changes in response to experience and environment. That is neuroplasticity. And adolescent brains are fantastically plastic. So I will say to you just from the start, you as parents, caregivers for adolescents, ultimately, you are the experts. What I'm going to say as a scientist is going to validate, hopefully, things that you know through your experience of being with adolescents, of raising adolescents and so forth. I've been very fortunate to have adolescents in young adults in my life in particular. But the real expertise in this comes from your experience. So never lose sight of that relative to what I say. Just talk a little bit about a little brain anatomy and such. So what is the size of your brain, or let's say by age 6, what is the size of the brain by age 6? Just the size. It's going to be 90 to 95% of its adult size by age 6, which, just to begin with, when I say that, may seem contradictory to where we're going then talking about all this extraordinary growth during adolescence, something that it's new in the last 15 years in particular. There's really been an enormous learning curve in terms of we began to see through the neuroimaging and such what was happening with young brains, and following that trajectory forward, and then learning and seeing this extraordinary window and time of neurodevelopment during adolescence. But 90 to 95% of its size by age 6. And you sitting there right now, if I ask you, hey, how much does your brain weigh? What would you choose? Would you choose this cabbage? It's about 3 pounds, or this grapefruit, a little over a pound? What do you think you've got there? If I was in a live audience with you, I'd be passing these around, and it's always interesting how many folks think they're cabbages. And they're right, because the brain weighs about 3 pounds. You got a cabbage there. And if we thought about the size, it would approximate the grapefruit. And then how many hemispheres do you have in the brain? You no doubt know you got 2. So I've cut the grapefruit in half. And a lot of times people will say, oh, I'm left-brained, I'm right-brained. Well, you have 2 hemispheres for a reason. They need to work together as a team. And there's a big connector between these hemispheres, and there's lots of connections within each. And that crosstalk that's happening, that hardware is going through a growth spurt during adolescence. It's one of the many important changes happening. And while we can say, yeah, a child's brain by age 6 is 90 to 95% of adult size, this cortex. Now, what's cortex mean in Latin? it means bark, the bark of a tree. You could think of it as the bark of a brain, the thickness of a couple of cabbage leaves covering the brain. But this very neuron rich, very, very important part of the brain, when's it going to mature? Pretty much, again, if we were live, you'd all be saying around 25 or so. And you're right. The cortex is going to be one of the last areas of the brain to mature, and we're talking the mid-20s. So that is how we can have a brain approximating the full size by age 6 and yet have tremendous change happening in software and hardware into the 20s. So that upgrading the hardware, we're going to just highlight. I'm not going to go too much into neuroanatomy, but especially in the time that we have, but there's some structures we really want to highlight here. And we really are upgrading the hardware. This cortex covering, the entire brain is going through some great and big changes. There's going to be more gray matter. We always like to hear that because as we age, we start to lose a bit of gray matter. So this is a time of growth, and it's also a time of pruning because you're going to get extra, and the brain is a use it or lose it machine. So what gets reinforced by experience is going to stay, it's going to strengthen. The brain is going to become more specialized. We talk about synapses and synaptogenesis and then pruning. These are things that are happening in early childhood in a very big way, and they're happening during adolescence in a very big way. And in addition to that, the brain is going to get more insulation. So you think of a pipe or a wire, and why do we insulate it? Because it can become more efficient, faster, better integrated system. This is what's happening in the adolescent brain relative to connections in the brain. So the brain's CEO, if we think of that whole cortex area, all those different regions, there are changes happening, as I've described, throughout all of them, happening at different times and all, getting coordinated and coming together. But the prefrontal cortex, and again, think of the most advanced area of the brain in a lot of ways, the brain's CEO, this in relative to the cortex is going to be the last area to mature in the mid-20s. And it's the stuff that teens are getting better at, but most of us could agree they are often inconsistent at. It's about overriding the more reactive, impulsive limbic area of the brain, which we'll touch upon. Frontal cortex is about impulse control. It's about good judgment and solving problems. And again, overriding that more reactive, just do it, emotional drive, which can be so strong during adolescence and at any time for that matter. Organization, planning, goal setting. This is all the work of the prefrontal cortex. And it is not done. And it is why we don't treat youth as adults, because their brain is not an adult brain yet. So while the frontal cortex is still maturing, no surprise, we're going to see more rigid thinking. And it's why often when we talk about options, a continuum of considerations and so forth, and we can be frustrated because it seems like a teen's thinking is one extreme or the other, and they're not as good at seeing the gray areas, the considerations. And of course, good decision making does come from experience, and we need to create those opportunities, leadership, teamwork, all of it, because until they get all the hardware, all the connections in between these different regions of the cortex, and until that prefrontal cortex is mature, it's harder. It's harder to bring all the information together and to weigh it and to consider consequences. And this is a brain that is more vulnerable to stress. period. And so no surprise, and this data is pre-COVID, pre-pandemic, that when teens are asked as what do they see as the leading problems among their peers, that 70% of them said anxiety and depression topped the issues that they were concerned about. That was number one. So as I mentioned, Crosstalk is still under construction. You have this big cord between the two hemispheres, the corpus callosum. It connects these together, but it's not just about sharing information. It's not just an information highway. It turns out that this is also a structure that is involved in creativity and higher thinking, and another structure like the prefrontal cortex that isn't going to be done till the mid-20s, along with a number of other regions of the cortex that are maturing into the 20s. So just thinking about that for a moment, when we want the brain to be able to talk to itself better, and movement is essential for brain development. We're going to do a little movement here, a brain booster, because I don't know how long you've been sitting before you got on here, but the brain needs to move. I never teach without integrating movement, which is a distressor to begin with. But interestingly, when we cross the body, that helps the brain, the hemispheres, to cross and talk as well. So if you'd like to join me, everything is an invitation, and anything I ask you to do today, I'm going to come back here a little bit so you can see me better. You won't see my feet, but looking at that picture, you can see her left ankle is crossed over her right. So go ahead and cross your left ankle over your right. Extend your arms out front. And you can turn your hands so that the thumbs are pointing down towards the floor, the back of the hands touch. And now go the opposite direction. Since the left ankle is over the right, bring the right hand over the left, interlace the fingers, bring the hands to the chest if you can. If you have shoulder issues, any concerns, just keep them out straight. If you can, bring your hands to rest on the center of the chest, as you see me doing and in the photo. And then if you'd like to do something even a little weirder, bring the tip of your tongue to touch the upper front of your teeth. Take a couple of breaths this way. Untangle your pretzel. This is called switching. You have a handout on this. Crossing the body is good for the brain. Think about the things that you do. It's why, walking can be very calming, because there is often a cross-body lateral movement, as we move our arms and such. There's a rhythm to walking, but think about things like canoeing, paddling, dancing that very intentionally cross the body, because this is a brain booster. And what's the deal with the tongue on the backs of the upper front teeth? Well, it's just a little conversation with your autonomic nervous system, stimulating the vagus nerve, which really helps to balance the nervous system. Good stuff. So cerebellum, we were just doing some movement. The brain needs to move. Concerns around adolescent brain development, and all kids for that matter, is that if kids are doing this all the time, if they're focusing on media, social media and so forth, and sitting, they're moving less. And the cerebellum, which is another area of the brain that will not mature until mid-20s, it's one of the last areas, again, as we talked about the frontal cortex to mature. This area of the brain isn't just about movement, coordination, and balance. Who has a great cerebellum? Well, dancers, soccer players, think of sports, think of activities that bring in movement and balance, but it also is involved in higher thinking. So exercise boosts development. Movement is critical. When I hear of budgetary cuts for after-school programs relative to movement, music, which is also wonderful for the brain, and arts, bad idea. This is, not where we want to be making our cuts. Kids need to move. So I want to talk with you briefly about the brain on stress because of the vulnerability, the heightened vulnerability of the adolescent brain, because the very structures that are going through some growth spurts and then not having a mature prefrontal cortex create this increased vulnerability. We want the prefrontal cortex online, that, thinking upper area of the brain. The dilemma with stress at any age, and then if you don't have all the hardware, all the more, is that the prefrontal cortex starts to go offline and we get pushed down into the limbic system, the more reactive, I often say Nike, just do it, that former advertising statement that they use so often, area of the brain, reactive, impulsive. We're getting pushed down in survival brain with stress. And it's not where we do our good thinking. It's not where good decision making and all of that happen. And the area of the brain that can start to take over is the amygdala. This is the kind of smoke alarm in the brain. Every moment, your brain is always scanning the environment via the amygdala to look for cues of safety and potential threats. And that is necessary for survival. However, you don't want that to dominate in brain function. And unfortunately, stress can push us to that place where the amygdala, the limbic system are more in the driver's seat than the prefrontal cortex. These areas of the brain that are involved in stress response are going through big changes. The amygdala is going through a growth spurt. We didn't really talk about the hippocampus, but that's your memory maker, and it's why under stress, it's harder to remember things. It's in the limbic region. It is very sensitive to stress and other neurotoxins, such as alcohol, which the adolescent brain has a unique response to. We'll be talking about that towards the end of this hour. And the prefrontal cortex, which is not mature. It's a kind of a saying in adolescent brain development that if you don't have a mature prefrontal cortex, you need to hang out with one. And that means us, adults. They need the influence of mature prefrontal cortexes around them to help them work through stress, and that we shouldn't expect them to be able to handle stress that an adult can. So we are going to do a cross-lateral movement to boost the brain and help the two hemispheres talk to one another. If you would like to join me, you can do this seated. Cross your left ankle over your right. Now, bring your arms out in front, extend them out, and turn your hands so the palms are facing outward and the thumbs are pointing towards the floor. And since I've crossed my left over my right ankle, I'm going to cross my right hand over my left hand and interlace my fingers. So I just went right over left and interlace my fingers. If any of this doesn't feel okay, then just let the arm part go and do the ankles. And now I'm going to turn my hands to rest on my chest. And you might want to take a breath here. And if this doesn't seem weird enough, I'm going to ask you to do one more thing and I'll explain. Take the tip of your tongue and touch the upper backs of your front upper teeth. So the backs of your upper front teeth. I think I said that backwards. I can't talk like this, so I'm going to move my tongue, but maybe take another breath or two this way. And you can untwist your pretzel. When you cross the body, you are helping those two hemispheres to work together as a team. Interestingly, when we bring the tip of the tongue up towards the roof of the mouth, the backs of those upper front teeth, we can stimulate the vagus nerve, the vagus nerves in the body, which have send a lot of information from the body to the brain, and that can help to shift the nervous system. So this is kind of a win-win for being able to boost the brain, focus. And if you have heard of children who were born without this connector between the two hemispheres, their therapy will involve lots and lots of cross-lateral movement. And fortunately, because the younger children and teens have so much plasticity, the brain can do amazing things to adapt and compensate. Okay, another brain part here, and we'll shift from the brain anatomy, but the cerebellum, if you felt on the back of your head, it's kind of like two little apples in the back. And that area of the brain we know is involved in movement and balance. So kids who move, who have great cerebellum, well, soccer players, basketball, dance, movement. The brain needs to move. Movement is critical for brain development, and it's an important consideration when kids are sitting so much, and particularly when we're trying to stay in our little boxes here. So it's one of the reasons that I'll do movement like we just did, and we'll do another one shortly, just to stimulate the brain and this area of the brain, which it turns out is about more than balance and coordination. It's part of complex thinking processes. And this too is going to be one of the last areas of the brain to mature in the 20s. This brain, as you know, as caregivers and parents of adolescents, is so far from done when we're talking about a teen. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the brain and stress. Can I see just maybe a nod or some thumbs up about if you're interested in a little bit more around this? I'm just kind of watching. Okay. Thank you. So that prefrontal cortex, we said that's the upstairs area of the brain. That's the thinking area of the brain that's going to override the more reactive emotional core limbic system of the brain. The dilemma is that when we're under stress that is prolonged or unaddressed, it can start to push us down in the limbic system. And I see that there might be a question. So maybe I'll just describe this little pathway, and then you can take a look, someone, at the question and see if you want to stop me for a moment, or we can take it at the end. Either way. So looking at this, as we get pushed down into the limbic system, the more reactive emotional core of the brain, there's a part in this area of the brain called the amygdala, and you might have heard of it because it acts like a smoke alarm. Every moment, every second, your brain is scanning the environment to look for cues of safety and potential threats. The job, the survival job of the brain. And one of the challenges that the amygdala is kind of going through some changes and a bit of a growth spurt during adolescence, and that this limbic system area of the brain to begin with is going to mature before the thinking upstairs, considering consequences of one's behavior. The limbic system, that doesn't think that way. That thinks about, got to get you before you get me, got to make sure everything's okay. I'm waiting for the next foot to drop. Is everything going to be okay? That's limbic thinking. The cortex is, well, there could be, is this the best choice? There could be consequences. I might not be able to use my iPhone or be on the internet for a month. That's totally cortex. Stress pushes us out of cortex down to what I refer to as the just do it. If you remember Nike, when they were using that tag, it's like, just do it, man. That's how the limbic system is. And that's what stress unaddressed without good tools to deal with it can go. the dilemma is that the teen brain, as I mentioned before, is exquisitely sensitive to stress, that key areas involved in stress response, as we just talked about, the prefrontal cortex, also the hippocampus, which is our memory maker, and the amygdala. This is why it's hard to remember things when you're under stress, because your hippocampus kind of starts going offline as well. But these areas are going through major changes during adolescence, and that makes this brain more sensitive to stress. So I just want you to consider 3 things in a very well-established field of research, whether you're 15, 55, or 105. There are 3 things that need to happen to be able to shift from stress response to reset the nervous system and reset the brain when things don't feel okay. You need to relax the muscles, allow the breath, and then we can calm the brain. And just to shift from talking about that as science to experiencing it, where it will do a breath practice in just a moment. But when we look at what teens' brains need, hands-on, skill-based learning, tools to build connectivity and manage stress, and they need decision-making and leadership opportunities to exercise that cortex. So I'm a retired dog musher. That's something I didn't mention, but we would run our lead dogs in tandem. Those are the first 2 dogs that you see. And then right behind the lead dogs, maybe there's a musher here in the audience, or someone who knows a musher in Idaho. I had a dog handler who lived in Idaho. Swing dogs are right behind the lead. And that is a leadership opportunity that you can be practicing leadership with your mentors right there without going off a cliff, going off the trail. Swing dogs. We rotate our dogs through the team up to swing to learn from the lead dogs. And that's how I see leadership opportunity and decision-making for teens. How are we bringing teens into a position, creating opportunities so that they can be practicing leadership without major consequences, and then ultimately going up into lead, but in what we call tandem with an adult right there, because that's the next thing would do as a musher from swing. I would bring them into lead to work with an experienced lead dog. Odyssey in the Mind is something that you may have in your community. It's where students work in teams with an adult coach to problem solve. You can check it out online, and hopefully I'll look forward to hearing about examples of maybe something similar to Odyssey of the Mind in your community when we're talking a little bit later. But these are critical skill-based opportunities that these brains need to be all that they can be. And when I was talking about those 3 conditions of dealing with stress, teens tell us, it's a quote from a teen there, people are always telling us not to stress out, but nobody's telling us how. And that's why I was mentioning about the conditions that are essential to shift from stress response to relaxation. So if I were to say to you right now, breath is the first thing to be affected by anxiety, and it's one of our most powerful tools to be able to then move out of anxiety. However, has anybody ever told you to take a deep breath when you were really anxious and you couldn't? Because if we're holding our core muscles, if we're really stiff with stress, kind of going into flexion and hunching forward, that's what stress does. It can be really hard to get a breath in. So instead, we do a movement. We focus on a movement. So this is goalpost arms. My arms, if you bring them out straight, then bend them at 90 degrees and come in as you inhale in. Exhale out. And just go at your own pace. I'm going to do this a couple more times. Inhale in and exhale out. And you may even reverse it so that you take a breath in with your arms, your chest open. And then exhale as you come together. by focusing on the movement, aware of the movement, and then just bringing the breath along, but not really telling somebody how to breathe, just to breathe, and they start to become aware of their breath, you can derail stress response. And if we have time at the end, I'll show you another breath technique if you're interested. But we're looking for simple ways to be tools that we can give to teens for self-regulation and well-being, because self-regulation is the gateway to learning. It's the gateway. When you talk about being resilient, the self-regulation is really the first thing that has to happen, along with the fact that who do children learn to self-regulate from? When an infant is born, they don't have, it's a skill that they develop, and they learn it from you, the parent, the caregiver. But it's not just about infants and small children. This is continuing to develop through adolescence, and it's never too late, I'm happy to say. So I work a lot with adults around self-regulation, the skills to be able to manage our thoughts and feelings and control impulse. And given what we have been through in the past year and some odd months, we've seen a lot of dysregulation where our regulation skills, particularly emotional regulation, have been compromised. So these simple tools are more important than ever. We are all challenged in terms of anxiety, high levels of anxiety and dysregulation. And the dilemma for adolescents is that poor self-regulation skills really increases the risk of substance abuse, self-medicating, because you know, when you're dysregulated, it doesn't feel good. So you look for ways to feel okay in that moment. Short-term, temporary solution with tons of risk attached to it. We see more sexual risk-taking, more juvie detention, delinquency issues, and the fact that there is this limbic surge, that the limbic area of the brain, the emotional core, the just do it area of the brain that is very survival oriented, is going to mature before the prefrontal cortex. That makes self-regulation extra challenging. So really a window of opportunity to be teaching self-regulatory skills. Just some thoughts around this and a resource as well. Stuart Shanker out of Canada. He has a pretty interesting website. He's also done a book called Self-Reg, but selfreg.ca is Canada. But if you're interested, and I'm happy to answer any questions, and not just this evening, you'll have my email with the information that is provided, because you have some handouts for tonight talking about the amazing adolescent brain. Of course, we want to reduce stress load, but that means looking around the environment too. I work with schools a lot around being trauma informed and just promoting self-regulation. And so having a calm space, a calm corner is, looking at your house, your environment, if you're, where teens are spending time, and if they're, what is the, lighting like? His overhead lighting is really hard with dysregulation. Is there a chair that you can move on, like a learnature chair or a bean bag? Or I have a weighted blanket right next to me, a shrug, things that allow a little bit of pressure. We work a lot with simple pressure and even acupoints to help reduce stress load. And there are things that you can have in the environment that really help with that. We have to be detectives and teach teens to be detectives about what calm feels like. So we use tools such as body awareness, body sensing, tightening a muscle and releasing it to notice the difference, because we're walking around with our shoulders up like earrings, and I see it in kids not even realize, and holding that, again, the stomach muscles really tight and stuff, so the diaphragm can't even move so that they can breathe well. And that anxiety begets anxiety when the breath is like that. How does it feel in my body when I'm not okay? And teaching strategies for self-calming. So the stress reduction workbook for teens, any resource I mentioned, I have no financial interest in. So just say that now. I'm a cherry picker. I love free. And when it's not free, inexpensive, easy to access resources. And that's how I feel about this workbook, which has very simple exercises in it. And one of them being watching your train of thoughts. So just briefly right now, if I said to you to imagine that you are sitting on a hilltop, and if you look down, you can see a train track. And on that train track, there's a train coming. And each car of that train, each train car is a thought. And as you watch that train go by, you can choose each car, each thought, whether you want to board that train, board that particular thought or train car, or just let it go by for right now, because thoughts are constantly coming and going. And so if we can make ourselves the observer and have a little bit of distance on it and just choose for now to let that train go by, each car, maybe one thought really grabs us and we get on that train car, but we can choose to step off again and let that be for right now and just focus, sitting, being present on that hilltop. That's just a short, abbreviated, but many of the practices are very, very quick and easy. There's another one called 5-finger breathing by Judson Brewer. If you were to search engine 5-finger breathing, you would see a powerful, short video. It's a nice Vimeo video on this practice. And if I take my index finger of one hand, doesn't matter which way you go, I'm left-handed, so I'm going to use my index finger on my left hand, and raise your other hand in front of you. Bring your index finger over to the outside of your little finger. Inhale as you trace up the outside edge of your little finger. Exhale as you come down. Inhale as you come up the 4th finger. Exhale down. You don't have to go at the pace I'm going now. I'm going to say what I'm doing, but you just find inhaling on the up the middle finger, exhaling down, moving my finger along the index finger of my other hand, exhaling down, and now the thumb up and down. Feel any different than you did maybe 2 minutes ago? This is, in the world of neuroscience, this is a phenomenally powerful tool. If a teen is highly dysregulated, if you're with somebody who cannot even catch their breath because of something that they are feeling or scared them or whatever is going on, we're involving touch. We're integrating, we're doing multisensory by doing touch, focusing on the breath. The breath gets regulated in the movement. This is multi-sensory, multi-science, very, very evidence-based, simple tools. So I'm going to shift from that, and I'm going to ask you to look at this face right now and ask you, what emotion do you see? This was one of a number of photographs shown in a landmark study, replicated many times now, but the original study by Dr. Yergel and Todd, showing these pictures to adults and to teens. Brains were wired up, functional MRI. So without doing anything invasive, we can see what part of the brain is working, what part of the brain that teens are using, and quite interestingly, not using when they are asked to interpret an emotion. So what do you see? Nearly all of the adults saw fear. Few said surprise, but it was pretty much all in agreement on fear. But teens saw something that they often see when we feel it's not there, that it's not what we're showing at all. And what would that be? Anger. When you're operating more out of the limbic area of the brain, which is what you see with the green circle, this is a composite of the brain scans to illustrate what was observed, and that is that the limbic area was dominant in teens interpreting emotions. As the brain is maturing and their prefrontal cortex is getting stronger and stronger, they will move up more and more as you see the circle in adult brain there, operating more out of the prefrontal cortex in interpreting emotions. But the reality of what you're seeing there ultimately equals a communication gap. And the interesting thing is that you may have a 10 or 11-year-old in your life, maybe even 12, and you just feel like you're really in sync. You get one another. You can read one another's emotions and maybe even finish a sentence for one another. And then at 13, 14, 15, it's like you're looking at an alien, or they're looking at you like you're an alien. They're actually going to lose some processing capacity in interpreting emotions as their brains are going through this major metamorphosis during adolescence. So processing more in the amygdala, that limbic region of the brain. And when that happens, you're going to react more quickly. You're more likely to see anger when it isn't intended. That's why I'm so big on self-regulation tools, that when that's starting to happen, we can get back upstairs, because nobody will help you go limbic faster than a teen. We can go with them like that. And there's a saying, another saying in adolescent brain development called the Q-tip principle. And I'll ask people, what do we mean by the Q-tip principle? And they'll say, well, cleaning your ears, you got to listen. You really got to listen well. And that's so true, of course. We need to listen and learn and be non-judgmental and what teens are saying to us. But we also need to quit taking it personally, okay? Because you've got this communication gap going on, and they are using less of their prefrontal cortex in interpreting emotions, and that means they're more likely to misinterpret facial expressions, and body language. So you really got to be aware of that they're keying into that more strongly, because that's what limbic does. So we may be really upset, anxious. They broke curfew. We've been waiting for a couple of hours. Auntie or grandma, came over, and finally they arrive, and we're like, where were you? We were so worried that grandmother came over. Do you remember when your brother and that he had that accident? And boom, 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 boom. And I'm trying to be in your face here by coming closer to the camera. We are concerned. We are, overwhelmed with concern. But concern can be really seen as disdain. disdain to a brain like this. And they're already stressed. They know they're late. They know they broke curfew, and they're totally reading into this. And so that is just a very easy, they're going to go more limbic, and we can easily join them. When adults don't express anger constructively, maybe you didn't hear this growing up. I just remember my father saying this a lot to me, and it was fair enough in the moment, but what were you thinking? The thing is that I think that he was thinking that I wasn't thinking, but I was thinking, but I wasn't thinking like he was thinking. And I'm not going to be able to think at that time like he was thinking, and nor can your teen, because it's a different brain. Again, doesn't have all the hardware, the software, going through major changes. And so we have to really think about how we communicate, how we move, what we're expressing in our face and our body. If we don't express anger constructively, then what's going to happen is they're not going to focus their attention on the behavior that we're really trying to target that needs to change. They do what we call triangulate, and they're very busy blaming you. And when we get into a limbic spiral, that of course can weaken the relationship, and they're going to be less likely to ask us for help the next time. So just thinking about, I'm sure you're familiar with I statements, and it's good adult to adult too, especially when we're communicating in ways like over Zoom and such, where we or the phone, where we or texting. Oh, texting is such a good example, because we don't have all these other cues of communication. But saying I'm very upset, or I'm frustrated with you right now. I'm feeling frustrated because you promised when you finished practice after school that you would text me before you started on your way home. You didn't text me, and I was waiting, and I didn't go into an important meeting. And then you get to the problem solving together. What can we do to solve this? I am intrigued because I spent a good part of my career in maternal and child health, now called family health. And so many parenting programs and parenting support for new parents. But parenting teens is a very unique challenge, as you well know. Again, science catching up with what you already knew. But my real point here is, and it's a time when a lot of parents, because of how busy in our careers and often stressed we are, parenting, job, pandemic, educating kids at home during all that's been happening, and just all of it, that we are more isolated than new parents, interestingly enough, who have a lot of resources targeted to them. So let's see parenting teens curriculum. This is just one example, guiding good choices. Let's see parenting support groups in our community, just like we have teen support groups, which are fantastic and certainly turned my life around in those years. I was very fortunate that they came to my community. But how about parents? So 3 most consistent adolescent behavioral changes across cultures. I'll be talking for a few more minutes, and then we're transitioning into discussion. Just to understand that novelty seeking behavior that you see, and how their interest can go they were really into the drums for 6 months, and then bing, now it's something entirely, it's archery, or it's some type of particular video game, or whatever it is. Seeking new experiences is neurodevelopmentally necessary, and it's not driven by being a butthead, just like their tremendous attraction to peers, to focusing on peer relationships. It is developmentally necessary, and it is neurodevelopmentally predictable, as is attraction to risk-taking, because you got dopamine levels that are fluctuating, changing. It's all part of adolescence. And as that part, these things are coming together, it's important to understand when we talk to teens about risk and when we are trying to prevent them from doing things that we know are risky to their developing brains, that they weigh risk differently. They don't see it the same way as an adult. And it's why in the past, a lot of the stuff that we've been doing around prevention and particularly tactics that emphasize scare tactics or long-term, if you do, don't do this, you won't be able to go to college in, 4 years or 2 years, whatever it is. Teens overestimate rewards relative to the immediate rewards that can come from risk-taking. And you need to take that into consideration and how we design prevention in our communities. This mismatch model, this neurodevelopmental tug of war between the limbic and the prefrontal cortex influences how they look at risk. And then you put more peers into it. Why would insurance companies have policies, regulations, pricing, and even states have regulations now around a new driver, a teen driver, and how many peers can be in the vehicle? If I was in your area right now and asked you for a ride home this evening, would you go faster because I was in the car? Or maybe there's 2 of us that need a ride? I don't think so. But a teen driver will if you put 2 peers in the vehicle. They're very, very sensitive to the influence of peers, to high emotions. It's why when we're, in a dispute or, can tell that they're really, going limbic about something and then poof, out the door. It's really good if we can, just maybe this isn't the moment to talk about that. Timing is everything. But can we do something to de-escalate it a little bit? They don't have all the crosstalk again to bring all the information together. And the interesting thing is that mindfulness training stimulates the prefrontal cortex in a way that decreases attraction to risk-taking. So if I had a teen in middle school or high school, I'd be looking at, or if I was teaching them at home, I'd probably jump onto Amazon and buy a copy of Mind Up, the middle school version. Mind Up, just those 2 words. It's designed, it's a curriculum for schools to teach kids about how their brains work, because who needs to know this in a big way? Adolescents need to know how their brains work. So it's got these age-appropriate neurodevelopmental lessons. And while the middle school, they don't have a high school version, and I could tell you about, other programs for that. But if they haven't had it in middle school, they need to get it in high school. So I would buy that middle school version that has all these little practices and exercises around simple, in the moment things to do around mindfulness to strengthen that prefrontal cortex, designed for kids, used around the world. And when I was working in Finland from 2015 to 17, it was going nationwide in schools. Why would Finland do that? Well, first of all, Finland figures if something is evidence-based and really effective, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. If the US has got a really good resource like that, and I can even buy a copy for $25 or so, and the curriculum, and then when it goes into schools, costs more than that, but you can learn all about it, cherry picking by, looking at this resource. But they're number one. They're number one in the world in education, and they don't want to lose it. So they, as they see the science roll forward, they integrate it in. I want to use the last few minutes. I have had the privilege of doing a lot of work in Idaho around substance abuse to teen brain development. And I just want to do a little bit of an exercise with you if I haven't PowerPointed you too much. So I just want to ask you to think about this question, and I'll keep an eye on the clock. At the same blood alcohol levels, if I were to ask you if this is true or false, like true or false, adolescents are more likely to show the effects of intoxication on muscle coordination compared to adults. So what do you think? I mean, they haven't been drinking that long. Hopefully they've hardly been drinking at all. Maybe this, is just their first or second time. Are they more likely? Is this true? Are they more likely to show the effects of intoxication on muscle coordination or not? This question is actually, the statement is false. And isn't that fascinating? Wouldn't you think that given that they don't have significant experience, perhaps like we do, with having a glass of wine with dinner or whatever, that they'd be succumb more to this warning sign? Because after we finish and if I go have a glass of wine and start to get a little sleepy, I was thinking maybe about having a second glass of wine, but well, I'm feeling kind of tired, and then go to the ladies' room or whatever. And well, those are warning signs to let me know not to have more, that one glass was enough. But because of the changes happening in their brain, they get those warning signs later, drink for drink compared to an adult. And so I know numerous instances where a teen was significantly under the influence, and responders, law enforcement, or adults with that youth did not know, because at that point they didn't act drunk. I'm not saying that you won't see that, but this is a challenge, that the warning signs are delayed. Second, is this okay with everybody? Doing these questions? Okay, at the same blood alcohol levels, thank you. Adolescents are less likely to black out than pass out. I mean, again, they haven't had as much experience drinking, presumably. Are they less likely to black out? And when we say blackout, that means that you are still awake, still able to drink more, have sex, maybe make choices, do things that you will have absolutely no memory of, but are awake, looking awake to others and doing, whereas pass out, of course, is out. This too is false. They're more likely to black out than pass out. So it's why we see a lot of alcohol poisoning among adolescents, because they can keep consuming. Another challenge. Are they more likely to become dependent on alcohol the earlier they start consuming? We talked about the dopamine levels, the reward, it's part of the reward circuitry of the brain. This is a challenge because you've got that circuitry setting up, and this is a powerhouse of learning, this brain. So yeah, unfortunately, it's true. Unfortunately, the earlier you start, the more likely you are to have to become dependent on alcohol at that time, or later, even later in life. So to understand from this, I mean, teens get exposed to a lot of things, but when we push things off 3 months, 6 months, small amounts of time, given the level of changes happening in this brain, or they drink and then they don't, it's huge because of all that's happening in the changes of this brain. I'm seeing a couple more comments. I think I'm just going to I'm going to pop ahead here and just share. I do want to share this with you. Free resource. If you want teens to show teens information, facts, it's not in a scary way. In fact, it's a fun way. Go to Mouse Party at this website, Science of Addiction, genetics.utah.edu. If you have any trouble finding it, just drop a note. But for adults and for youth, a great way, there's a mouse party and you choose the mouse. Each mouse is a different substance, and it shows exactly how it acts on the brain. It's not about scaring, it's not about judgment, it's about reality of how substances interact with the brain. and very, very creative website. Okay, I'm going to say one more thing here and go to questions. I'm guessing that you know that adolescents need about at least 9 to 9.5 hours of sleep a night, and some scientists would say 10. The sleep centers are in transition. The melatonin is being secreted 2 hours later at night. So if you're getting up and, getting at the school bus at 7 or, 6:30, whatever, arriving to school, the melatonin's in the system that much later. It's hard. It's why some schools have chosen to shift their hours because this is a brain where sleep is in transition and sleep is essential. There are more than 50 neurotransmitters being released during sleep that are essential for brain development. So if kids are exhausted, it's challenging relative to putting together the best brain you can. And the last comment I'll make here is that sleep deprivation mimics other stuff. So when I hear, and I would hear this often with some of the young people that were coming to stay with me at the time, that they had just gotten a diagnosis of ADHD, and what I would be wondering and kind of asking indirectly was there a sleep assessment done? Because it can look just like it and can look like depression, symptoms of depression. When you're seeing a lot of more, obviously with what we're talking about, the changes, there is more emotional ups and downs in adolescence as the brain is maturing and the changes with dopamine levels and so forth. But when you really see a significant change, sleep assessment, because it's associated with more aggressive behaviors and absolutely associated, as we know as adults as well, with an increased risk of obesity. So I'll stop here and just come out of screen share. I want to thank you. I know that's a long time to sit and they just open up to questions now. I hope that there's some useful information here. Let's see a question here about false true. So maybe, unless I maybe you can tell me the question again. Did I misspeak on something or wasn't clear?
They were answering your questions.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. And so, and we were in agreement about that. And I'll tell you that if I was in a room with 50 psychologists and another 50 physicians and, pediatricians and so forth, there would be, most folks would think the opposite of what I was saying. It's new science. We're learning more each day, but the last decade has been almost literally a revolution in understanding adolescent brain development. It's led to changes in all kinds of policies and laws, even at the Supreme Court level. I see lots of mushers in Montana. Yeah. And Doug Swingley, won many times. They had the privilege of meeting him along the way. People couldn't figure out why he was so fast.
And this is unmuted if you guys have any questions here. And then everybody on Zoom, you're welcome to unmute your microphone and ask if you have questions or type it into the chat.
Great. And I'm just taking a look at chat box, and no question is too small, and I may not know the answer. If I don't, I will tell you and I will find out.
I have a question. I am going to school to be a teacher, and I'm hoping to work mostly with like 4th through high school senior. And I'm working on trying to write a paper on, it's a persuasive research essay on the importance of mental health, like trying to normalize talking about mental health. And excuse me, when I was in high school, I'm embarrassed to tell you that the school I went to was, a lot of my peers had a huge drinking problem. I never partook because I was too scared to, but I noticed that as I'm getting older, people who are depressed, they tend to drink more. And is it safe to say that students, like adolescents, they do that as well, that just to kind of, because they don't have a healthier outlet to, sorry, I just got off work, I'm really tired, they don't have a healthier outlet to speak up and say, hey, I'm having this problem. And so they just kind of, they get lured into alcohol and substance abuse a lot easier, because it just seems like it's, well, this looks like it'll be helpful. Does that make sense at all?
It makes huge sense. I really appreciate you and asking this question, because it's something that I always talk about when I am talking about trauma. And when we think about prevention overall with substance abuse, there's the experimentation, and that is the issue for some teens. And we talked about how they're driven towards novel experiences. But I think, when you see patterned use, often substance use is not about peer pressure, and teens will tell you that. And it's not, so it's not about, fitting in or because this party and such. They are self-medicating. And when they're, therefore, in thinking about prevention and intervention, that's got to look different, because it's got to address what they're struggling with. And it's certainly a global issue, but there's a very good book that has just Mark Bracken, and I'm failing on the title of the book right now, but I can provide it to my colleagues to share with you. Mike Bracken out of the Yale Child Center has done a book on the social emotional state of America. And it probably would be useful for your persuasive research essay. We are really in a crisis, and this was again before COVID. And COVID, the pandemic within the pandemic is stress, agoraphobia, the anxiety that has occurred because of what's happened, here and everywhere. And so it is, my belief that we will see, much higher levels of self-medication. And, teens watch, of course, what adults do, and we may, do it very subtly that we don't even see it as self-medication, but this is a huge issue. And it means that we really need to be thinking about those tools that's why a huge part of my work focuses on simple tools for self-regulation and how to be helping them to understand how to work with the full spectrum of emotions. There are many of us that come from a family or cultural setting where you don't talk about emotions, and you can't run from an emotion. You suppress it, you push it away, you'll end up either expressing it through your health, trying to self-medicate it. It just and teens know that they're feeling it, they're struggling with it. Do you feel that was responsive to your question?
Yes, actually it was. I was going to ask you if you could recommend possibly a couple of places to look, because I'm kind of stumped. There's so much information out there.
Well, we'll definitely take a look at that book out of Yale, and I don't want to flip out of the minimize my screen just in case something would happen. And ironically, I was just looking at it and I can't think of the title, but I can, if you email me, I'll provide you the name of the title, and I'll also send it to Sharon and Toomey so they have it. Also want to mention too, because I'm always trying to figure out what can fit in the time that we have. And there's a prevention, oh, it's an intervention actually that I often talk about relative to substance abuse in teens, and that's called Preventure. And so Canada has been very creative and successful because they evaluate very rigorously interventions that they are doing with teens. And Preventure is a targeted intervention for teens around substance abuse that looks at, it does some assessment around personality and an attitude assessment to figure out what teens will be at higher risk. And it's a 4-part curriculum, four classes basically. But it's very different than what you would typically see around substance abuse. Like, do you know what that can do to your brain? And pictures of crashes and things like that, because I mentioned before, that doesn't work very well. It doesn't work with teen brains much at all. When you look at what's effective and what's not, that's going to be ranking really low. What they discovered is that when teens see that they are being manipulated, teens do not like to be manipulated, right? Nobody does. And teens are very sensitive to that. So in the tobacco prevention, there was a point with information that you got teens not starting or stopping smoking to a certain point. And then we hit a plateau in public health and we were stuck. And what they found is that and this was also the time at which Joe Camel and a lot of advertising in smoking, losing their adult market, started to target teens. And when teens were shown that it's media literacy, this program, this curriculum, but you could think about how you could do this yourself or read about, go to their website, take ads and analyzed how they were marketing to teens to get teens money, adults manipulating teens to use. And we see that with alcohol advertisements hugely now in, teen things that I just haven't seen so targeted to them before. And I see that with states that are legalizing marijuana, because I live in one of those states. They learn media literacy skills, and then they create messages for teens from their perspective of what would be effective, of why I wouldn't want to do this. So that's a bit long-winded, I guess, but take a look at Preventure. And I hope that might have some insights. And if I was working with a school and such, I'd super want to, it's not a year long, it's not a semester. It's basically 4 classes around this, and been shown to be effective, not just for alcohol, but multi-substance use and so forth. And that's what we're dealing with in reality with teens too. They're not using one thing. With marijuana, it's showing that it affects a lot of the same areas of the brain as alcohol. And of course, the marijuana that the THC kids are accessing now is radically different than the dirt-like stuff when I was growing up. But also it's the issue of mixing. Things are getting mixed that didn't happen when we were kids.
Thank you.
Another resource I'm just going to mention relative to that question, do you take a look at Dan Siegel's work, Siegel. Dan, and he's got a lot of, you don't have to buy his book. He's got a lot of good free stuff books, actually. He has a lot of good stuff on Amazon, on his website. I'm seeing this link here, and I'm hoping I will. I'm not sure if I click on that link, if I'm going to go away from the screen. So don't want to do that, but I will. I'm going to, as we're waiting for another question maybe to come in, I'm going to see if I can Google it quick. I need to have my list of when I'm focusing on one thing, names of things kind of go out the other end of my brain. So many bytes of memory to work with. I'm just going to very quickly, if you're okay with it, see if I can quickly find. Oh, I turned the internet off on my phone, so this might be. Not as fast as I want it to be. See if I can get it to come up. Anything else? Ah, I've got it. I was mispronouncing his last name a little bit, which is not good because that's my alma mater. Permission to Feel. And that's the title of this book, Permission to Feel by Michael Brackett. Really, Michael Bracken was my professor in epidemiology. He taught at Yale School of Medicine. Grateful. This is Michael Brackett. Permission to Feel. We need to be able to talk about feelings and help teens talk about their feelings. So instead of asking, what were you thinking? What would have been really helpful is to ask, what were you feeling? This has a lot to it because you're talking to a different area of the brain that becomes more accessible under stress. So if I was a principal at a school and someone, and I went down to the principal's office a fair amount of time, and what were you thinking? I can't get the cortex right now. I can't tell you, and if you start asking me who, what, when, where, there's a type of interviewing that called FETI, Forensic Experiential Trauma Interviewing, that was started by the military and is now used in lots of different settings. And the bottom line around this is that when somebody's under stress, you're not going to get good who, what, when, where, because that's cortex. And the more you press for that, or even give a suggestion, well, where were you at the corner of fourth or fifth? And you keep asking me, fifth, I'll just say. And then maybe at some point now later, I will recall when I'm getting more into cortex, or it will be determined that I was on, 4th Avenue Street and I was lying because I answered that way. But I'm not in cortex. You start by asking me how I feel. What were you feeling when you did? Because we're coming in through the senses, pulling in a different area of the brain that will allow me to work from the bottom up. And I could go into a whole arena around this, but there's way more information going from the body to the brain than from the brain down to the body. And we start with the senses. Every emotion starts as a sensation in the body, and we need to learn how to feel into that so that we respond to those cues before our body ends up shouting at us or we go limbic. So I mentioned there's a link to addiction in younger drinkers. What other concerns do you see with young drinkers or drug use? Well, so many, because we finally got alcohol out of cough syrup for children, right? Because alcohol it is a neurotoxin. That's the bottom line. So, it's not a brain builder at any age, but, our mature cortexes, our mature, brains handle it in a different way than a teen. Neurotoxins are no friend of a developing brain. So babies don't drink, but adolescents have this opportunity. And so we are seeing to be exposed to neurotoxins. And that's a saying, even a little bit of a delay is a huge advantage, because we see certain structures in the brain that are very sensitive to neurotoxins and that are going through growth spurts. Big example, hippocampus. I mentioned the hippocampus really quickly. Hippocampus is our memory maker. And so if you have injure your hippocampi, because you got one on each side, and they're severely damaged, you won't be, if I tell you my phone number, you're not going to be able to recall it, remember it, or, and new information will not be able to get consolidated and pulled back. And by the way, a lot of my learning is hugely consolidated while we sleep. So this is a big issue when teens aren't getting enough sleep in terms of that consolidation of memory. Same for us as adults, but they're learning so much, they're learning machines. So smaller hippocampi have been documented many, many times in heavy adolescent drinkers, and especially when we look at binge drinkers. And now those teens are being followed forward to determine can the hippocampi recover, because clearly they have demonstrated memory impairment that is sustained even when they become abstinent and they're not using. So we know that it can affect areas of the brain in a way that wouldn't happen with an adult unless we're talking very, very extreme situations. And of course, making decisions that are life altering in a time when everything goes viral and it becomes a permanent record and stuff. So stupid things that we may have done growing up and gone to a party and gotten under the influence and such, but the risks associated with it for teens now is just so magnified. And then the mixing of substances, there's stuff available probably in your medicine chest that they didn't have. And farming parties, PHARM, a bowl full of pills and some booze around and stuff. It's just at a whole nother level. Have I seen data about marijuana use by teens? Yes, lots of it. There's another book out, Alex Berenson, and I'm feeling pretty good about having his name correct, because we were both, I think we followed one another in an event in Idaho. And Bruce, you might want to, if you could look for that title for me, I'd love it. But Tell Your Children the Truth, I believe. Tell Your Children the Truth About Marijuana is the title. You're going to find there's a lot of data about it. Europe was looking at this issue long before we were, with more rigorous studies because of the kind of health data they have. They were particularly looking at the emergence of mental health problems during adolescence, when adolescents are using marijuana, being exposed to THC, because there was a very clear pattern for schizophrenia. There's a genetic, link for that as to whether that switch gets flipped or not. The epigenetic switch, clearly marijuana is a contributor to flipping the switch. So, but we're seeing now emergency rooms are being overwhelmed. And I've heard this, you are the origin, Idaho. I know we have folks from Montana too, but I think the tall cop also speaks in Montana and a lot of other states. And, talking about what's coming into the emergency room, or talk to folks who work in a hospital, because we're seeing these toxicity cases, these extreme psychotic breaks relative to the different ways that marijuana and THC can be consumed in very high doses. It's a very different situation. And because it affects many of the same areas of the brain as alcohol from a neurotoxic perspective, and then maybe you put the two together, it's a big deal. So where does this take me? Here. That I see states, I keep pushing state of Alaska, since we have more and more cannabis and marijuana for sale shops and so forth. how, and my community is being really good about having this conversation. You've got to talk about teen users. You've got to be, talking in the community about the special considerations relative to the adolescent brain. I'm not dissing pot. I'm not. It's a complex issue, but it's a very special issue relative to the teen brain.
Dr. Chamberlain?
Yes.
Oh, good. You can hear me. I don't use Zoom very much, so I don't know how to ask a question to you. But I have a question for you. Recently the Supreme Court, and actually you kind of touched on this a little bit, ruled that juveniles can be tried as adults and put away for life, is the understanding I have. What is your opinion of that? To me, the assumption is that these kids cannot be rehabilitated is a reason why they would have that kind of a sentence.
Well, of course, I strongly disagree with that. They can't be rehabilitated. And there's a type of assessment that, ideally with adults and, anyone in a courtroom, that to assess their competency to stand trial, that, should be happening, but it doesn't really take into consideration the maturity of the brain. I think we had some capital punishment went off the table because it was considered unconscionable relative to the fact that their brain wasn't mature. But we see ebbs and flows and maybe more than that in terms of the court shifting in different directions. And I'm talking personally, in my opinion, I disagree with this because I just don't see how we can say someone can't be what type of rehabilitation are they going to be getting with a life sentence now? I don't, so that would be my question around what that's going to look like. I'm assuming there's assessment then that's happening, that it is just determined that they are, far too dangerous to ever be out of maximum security and such. But it's not about not being accountable for your behavior. That's never off the, you're accountable for your behavior, but what is happening to be able to work with a youth in this situation that they can mature and learn. So it's very tricky, but I would strongly suspect that there's very little happening with them in a decision like that. I see Montgomery versus Louisiana. Yeah. So I think there's going to be tremendous controversy around this, and I hope that's true. And while I say that, I am not talking about you're not accountable and that you don't have to pay your debt to society, but we've lost some tread in some states around what's happening with rehabilitation, and then I don't necessarily equate that to privileges either.
Right. Yeah, some of these kids are doing horrendous things, and there's no doubt that they're doing horrendous things. But to assume that they understand that it was horrendous when they did it, for example, kill somebody, or I don't know, even torture, it doesn't make sense to me that you can't wait till they get to be 25 and find out they're still that way. Evaluate them.
Well, Yeah, it's been, I work with court systems, a fair amount, not specific to, obviously law, is not my area, but just around getting courts to be trauma informed to begin with, because what type of assessment of, the childhood adversities, lifetime experiences, not an excuse, still accountable,
Right.
but it's going
Right.
to really, determine what it needs to happen. And then also resilient, when I've worked with Juvie Justice for the state of Alaska, they were very on board for doing what we call ACEs assessment, adverse childhood experiences, as a starting point, although in reality that doesn't capture a lot of the trauma that happens during the teen years. So the first thing it was asking them is talk to the teens you're working with about, what their experiences have been. But we need to be measuring resilience as well. We have excellent resilience measures for children and youth that really helps us to understand what turns it around.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Our time, we just have about 3 more minutes left. If anybody else wants to get in the last question. Thank you, Linda. This was a great educational class.
Well, thanks for spending an evening doing this. I'm sure everyone's had a long day, and I really appreciate you caring about this. And again, beyond caring, you are the experts. What you bring to the table as parents and caregivers of teens. It's the real stuff.
Now, were you recording this from your laptop?
No, I leave it to the organization if they want to require record. I don't even think I can. It has to be the person who set it up. But I did get a message a few minutes in about could it be recorded?
Okay, we started recording a little bit into it, so
Yeah,
it could.
you've got it then.
Thank you. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Welcome to the people from Idaho Falls that joined in it as well. And thank you, Linda Chamberlain, for speaking to us tonight from the other side of the country.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good evening.